talking about possible increment. Why don't they just really? Can you answer one simple question?
They want to release the hostages.
All of them?
Yes.
How many?
They accepted a ceasefire.
Lying. They said maybe 10.
Give us a 60-day pause in this war. We will return every single hostage. Israel stands in the way every single
There's no answer to
time.
this. Why are they holding the hostages?
What is your view about this? Because this is a talking point that comes up a lot.
It's not a talking point. There are 50 lives down there.
Hold on a second,
It is definitely a talking point. When you block humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip for 3 months straight, it not only impacts the Palestinians, which I know you couldn't care less about, but it also obviously is going to impact the hostages. They're going to starve to death as well.
In today's video, Abby Phillip and Anna Kasparian absolutely destroy Scott Jennings in a heated debate on NewsNight with Abby Phillip. While Scott Jennings leaned on the usual talking points, the reality is brutal. Famine has already been declared in Gaza, aid workers and journalists have been deliberately targeted, and Israel's own citizens are protesting Netanyahu's refusal to accept hostage release deals. So let's dive in and watch how Abby Phillip and Anna Kasparian shut down Scott Jennings on NewsNight with Abby Phillip.
And Max, this is just a continuation of almost a snowball effect, as the war has been being carried out, I think, like this for some time now. But the combination of the targeting of journalists and also the backlash inside Israel and outside of Israel is starting to worry a lot of people who are pro-Israel, by the way.
Yeah, including me. I mean, I'm a strong supporter of Israel, but I'm very concerned about what I'm seeing that the Netanyahu government is doing in Gaza, because if you listen to what the IDF, the Israeli generals themselves, said about a year ago, was they had concluded their military objectives in Gaza. Hamas was no longer a threat to Israel, and so they were basically saying there was not much more that the Israeli military could do in Gaza, and yet the offensive continues, because for Netanyahu to turn off the war would be very politically perilous, because he is really at the mercy of the far-right parties in his own coalition, and so he keeps on fighting, even though the cost is growing, not just to Palestinians, but also to Israelis, because remember, there are a lot of Israeli soldiers who are on the front lines as well. So to my mind, this is a terrible tragedy, not only primarily, of course, humanitarian tragedy for the people of Gaza, but it's really a long-term tragedy for the state of Israel. I was just looking at a poll that showed, Gallup showed that only 30% of Americans now support the war that Israel is waging in Gaza. This is going to cause an entire generation of Americans and countries around the world to turn against the Jewish state. And as somebody, again, who supports the Jewish state and stands with the Israelis who are out there protesting against the war, what Netanyahu is doing is horribly destructive, not only for Gaza, but also for Israel.
I would agree with that. And, you know, I don't believe for a second that those journalists were not targeted. I think journalists are being targeted in Gaza. They're not allowing international journalists to report on the ground to enter the Gaza Strip, unless, of course, they're being accompanied by IDF soldiers. And hundreds of journalists have been slaughtered in Gaza. Every single time it happens, Netanyahu comes out and says, oh, it was a mishap. And the United States just forgets about it and moves on, continues providing more bombs. Thank you for saying what you're saying, because you are correct that people are losing their support for Israel over the conduct of, I don't consider this a war at all. I do consider it a genocide. When you have humanitarian aid workers being slaughtered, when you have every single hospital bombed, when you have the entire Gaza Strip leveled, that's not a war. A war, if you do targeted strikes and you go after the combatants. 729 magazine, an Israeli publication, obtained IDF documents showing, their data shows that 83% of the people slaughtered in Gaza are civilians, 83%. Let me say it again, 83%. How are you going to call that a war against Hamas?
What Anna Kasparian's point out here is backed up by a ton of evidence that can't just be brushed aside. For example, that stat about civilians making up the overwhelming majority of casualties isn't some fringe claim. It's consistent with data cited by Israeli outlets, UN agencies, and even independent humanitarian monitors. When over 4 out of 5 people being killed are civilians, you're not talking about a precision campaign against Hamas. You're talking about collective punishment on a population of 2 million people. And let's be real, journalists aren't just accidentally being killed. The Committee of Protect Journalists has said Gaza is the deadliest conflict for journalists in modern history, with more media workers killed in just a few months than in years-long wars elsewhere. Combine that with the fact that foreign reporters are barred from entering without IDF escorts, and it becomes pretty clear Israel doesn't want the world to see what's actually happening on the ground. On top of that, we can't ignore how much US weapon sales are fueling this. American-made bombs have been linked directly to strikes on refugee camps and hospitals, and yet the flow of military aid continues. That's why international pressure is ramping up. Gallup and Pew polls show US public support for Israel's campaign is collapsing, especially among younger Americans.
This latest attack that killed the 5 journalists, the story is that there was a camera that was operated by Hamas. I'm going to play what Barak Ravid, who's perhaps one of the best sourced reporters in both the United States and Israel on this story. This is what he said last night about that story.
At least from what I hear from some Israeli officials, there are serious questions about this version. And it is not at all clear that this was indeed an approved target. Whether it was a Hamas reconnaissance outpost in the hospital or not, there's been a lot of arguments between the general staff in the IDF headquarters and the Southern Command regarding targeting.
So Israeli officials said that the journalists were not the targets, but they were in fact killed. They also said that there were terrorists who were in the group of 20 that were killed. But this is the type of thing that has caused the world to ask very serious questions about how they are conducting this war. That they would, if you take this story at face value, bomb a camera, kill 20 people as collateral, and then say, as Netanyahu said in a statement today, that this was a tragic mishap.
Yeah, I think they said also 6 terrorists were killed in the attack.
Total BS.
We've heard, how do you know?
I know it's BS because of the IDF's internal documents, which indicate that 83% of people killed there happen to be civilians.
That there weren't any terrorists?
I'm not going to sit here and regurgitate the lies from the Israeli
So
government
we've
as
had-
they're
so-
conducting a genocide.
so we've had
Anna,
four-
even
we've had-
if there were 6 terrorists killed in the strike, there were 20 people killed total. So there were a lot of people who were killed who, according to Israel, were not terrorists. 5 of those people were journalists. The second strike occurred when there were aid workers coming to assist people who had been caught up in the strike. That's what I'm talking about. I can't litigate the terrorists or not, but even based on their version of it, that is what I think is causing a lot of concern.
Sure, look, it's a war. Tragic things happen. People that you hope would not be killed get killed, and you in an active war zone. It happens in every active war zone for all of human history. I would note we've had 4 people talk and tell me, and not a single person has said the word hostage yet. There's still 50 hostages.
Right. Well, Israel doesn't care about the
on the
hostages. Let's not lie about that
Just to be
either.
clear, I said hostages because I was talking about the hundreds of Israelis who were in the streets today demanding a hostage deal
I know.
from Netanyahu
And guess what?
demanding that this war end immediately.
And the deal has to be executed by the people who took the hostages, Hamas. They're the ones holding them. They're the ones who have been holding them since October the 7th.
What really jumps out here is how the conversation always gets deflected back to hostages as a way to justify whatever Israel does, even when the facts on the ground point to something far more disturbing. Nobody's denying the hostages exist. That's been a tragedy from day one. But focusing only on that ignores the mountain of evidence that Israel has systemically targeted civilians, aid convoys, and yes, journalists. Take the so-called tragic mishap Scott Jennings keeps defending. Groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders have documented more than 100 journalists killed in Gaza since October, making this the deadliest war for reporters in modern history. That's not collateral damage, that's a pattern. And the idea that they're just bombing a camera is absurd when you consider how often the IDF has bombed press vests, marked vehicles, and even UN schools. Then there's the hostage question. Independent reporting, including from Israeli outlets like Haaretz, has shown that Hamas has actually put ceasefire and hostage release proposals on the table multiple times. The holdup hasn't been them refusing to deal. It's Netanyahu rejecting those deals under pressure from the far-right ministers in his coalition. So when people say, why doesn't Hamas just release them? The reality is, Israel's government has been prioritizing its political survival over bringing those hostages home. And here's the bigger picture. According to UN agencies, famine is already breaking out in Gaza. The blockade on food, water, and medical aid isn't accidental. It was announced openly by Israeli officials as policy. That's collective punishment, plain and simple. And under international law, it qualifies as a war crime.
They keep, talking about possible incremental. Why don't they just release? Can you answer one simple question?
They want to release the hostages.
All of them?
Yes.
How many?
They accepted a ceasefire.
They said maybe 10.
Give us a 60-day pause in this war. We will return every single hostage. Israel stands in the way every single time.
There's no answer to this. Why are they holding the hostages?
What is your view about this? Because this is a talking point that comes up a lot.
It's not a talking point. There are 50 lives down there.
Hold on a second,
It is definitely a talking point. When you block humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip for 3 months straight, it not only impacts the Palestinians, which I know you couldn't care less about, but it also obviously is going to impact the hostages. They're going to starve to death as well.
You're saying Israel is starving the hostages?
I'm saying, yes, yeah. When you block humanitarian aid for 3 months, where do you think they're going to get the food from?
Max, Israel
what a joke.
And Hamas have been circling around a lot of different hostage deals, ceasefire deals. They haven't happened for a number of different reasons. And with the caveat, as we have said numerous times, Hamas is a homicidal terrorist organization that should never have hostages in the first place. But what is stopping a deal from actually happening to get these last hostages out? Because many Israelis think that the Netanyahu government is not doing enough to take a deal and get them out.
I think that is ultimately the stumbling block, not making any excuses for Hamas, which is this evil, genocidal terrorist organization, but they have indicated a willingness to do a deal to release some of the hostages. There was a deal that was done earlier in the year that released a bunch of hostages. Most Israelis want to do that deal because most Israelis are convinced the only way the 20 remaining hostages who are still alive are going to come home is with a deal. But Netanyahu insists on military action, which most Israelis see as endangering the lives of the hostages. And what Netanyahu is saying, he will keep on fighting until Hamas ceases to exist. Well, Hamas is not going to give up. And so basically, that is consigning Israeli troops to perpetual war in Gaza with no endgame in sight. And Netanyahu refuses to make a deal with Hamas. He refuses to allow the Palestinian Authority to come into Gaza to try to have some Palestinian governance, which is more responsible and law-abiding than what they've seen in recent years. So it's a disaster. There's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. But right now, I think there's a general sense in Israel that Netanyahu simply does not want to do the deal.
You said endgame. What is the Hamas endgame? What is their stated goal?
Well, they want to stay. They want to remain as an organization.
No. What's their stated goal as it relates to the Jews in Israel?
They want to destroy the state of Israel. There's no question about it. But they're not in a position to do that anymore because the IDF has rendered them no longer a credible military.
What's their stated goal as it relates to Jewish people?
They want to exterminate Jews. But so what, Scott?
I don't think that
that doesn't justify what Israel is doing in Gaza.
I think the point that he's making.
You're acting like we're dealing with rational actors.
No,
we're not. There may not be a deal to be done with rational actors.
Can we talk about
I'm not acting like anything at all. But the question on the table for the entire globe is, what is it going to take to A, bring those hostages home and end the killing and the suffering of the Palestinian people? And at the end of the day, it has to be a deal between Hamas and the Israeli government. And Hamas is a horrible entity, but it has to be a deal with them.
But you're saying you're going to leave them in place.
And there will be a deal with them.
No, you're saying you're going to leave them in place.
The only way, Scott, the only way...
I'm saying what?
Are you saying that you said we have to have a deal with Hamas? You're anticipating that we leave them in place.
Scott, did I say anything of the sort?
Yes, you just said we have to have a deal with Hamas.
No. I did not say anything of the sort. In order to get the hostages out, go ask President Trump. He has been trying to broker a deal between Hamas and Israel. None of that is new. None of that is novel.
What Scott Jennings keeps dodging here is the simple reality that Netanyahu has had multiple chances to bring those hostages home, and he's refusing them. Independent reporting from Haaretz and even US intelligence leaks confirmed that Hamas actually offered several deals, full hostage exchanges for a ceasefire. The stumbling block hasn't been Hamas walking away, it's been Netanyahu and his far-right cabinet rejecting those offers because their political survival depends on keeping this war going on. That's why you see Israelis themselves, the hostage families, camping outside Netanyahu's house begging him to take a deal. And Scott Jennings' whole line about Hamas wanting to destroy Israel, of course that's in Hamas's charter. Nobody denies their extremism. But here's the thing, Israel itself admitted last year that Hamas was no longer a credible military threat. They don't have the capacity to exterminate Jews or destroy Israel. What they do have is just enough presence for Netanyahu to keep using them as a pretext to level Gaza, block aid, and tighten his own grip on power. That's why this war has dragged on with no endgame, because ending it would mean Netanyahu loses his political cover. Meanwhile, the humanitarian disaster isn't hypothetical. UN agencies have already declared famine conditions in Gaza. Save the Children and Oxfam report that kids are literally dying of malnutrition while trucks of food and medicine sit at the border blocked by Israel. That's not fog of war, that's policy. And when Scott Jennings tries to reduce the whole debate to Hamas bad, he's just ignoring that the actions of Israel's government are directly creating mass civilian suffering, prolonging the hostage crisis, and isolating Israel globally. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.